It started as an ordinary afternoon for 17-year-old Mia, who was on her way home from school, carrying nothing but her backpack and a smile. But within moments, her day took a turn she never expected. Out of nowhere, a police officer pulled up beside her, his tone sharp and accusatory. Confused, Mia tried to explain herself, but the officer wasn't interested in listening. What happened next stunned onlookers. The officer accused her of matching the description of someone involved in a nearby theft. Mia, shaken but firm, insisted on her innocence, but his demands became harsher. Just as the situation seemed to spiral out of control, something unexpected happened, a moment of truth that changed everything. In this video, we'll uncover the events that followed and how justice found its way into this story. Stay tuned to see how one courageous act turned the tide. Mia stood frozen, her heart pounding as curious bystanders began to gather. She kept asking herself why this was happening. What had she done wrong? The officer, towering over her, radioed for backup while demanding to see her ID. Mia explained she didn't have one on her. She was just a high schooler walking home. But her words seemed to bounce off the officer like they didn't matter. The crowd murmured, some whispering in disbelief. A man in a nearby shop stepped outside, watching closely, while a woman holding her toddler pulled out her phone to record. "She's just a kid," someone in the crowd called out, but the officer didn't flinch. Mia's hands shook as she tried to speak, but every word seemed to make things worse. Then, just as the situation reached its boiling point, a voice from the crowd spoke up, loud and clear, catching everyone's attention. The voice belonged to an older man, Mr. Carter, who lived in the neighborhood. He stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "Officer, I've seen this girl walk by here every day. She's no troublemaker," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. The officer hesitated for a moment, but then turned to Mr. Carter with a sharp look. "Sir, stay out of this," he barked, his hand still hovering near his belt. Meanwhile, Mia could feel tears welling up, but she refused to cry. She stood her ground, clutching her backpack tightly. Around her, the murmurs grew louder. "Why's he targeting her?" someone whispered. "This isn't right," said another. Phones were now out in almost every hand, recording every moment. The officer radioed again, this time asking for confirmation on the suspect's description. His eyes flickered with doubt, but his stance remained rigid. Mia, glancing at the growing crowd, began to feel a strange mix of fear and hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would come to light. But before anything could happen, another patrol car pulled up, and everyone braced for what might come next. As the second patrol car came to a stop, two officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene. The tension in the air was thick. Mia's breaths were shallow as she wondered if they would listen to her or side with the officer. The crowd had grown larger now, their voices growing louder, some shouting for justice, others pleading for calm. One of the new officers approached the first, who immediately began explaining his version of the situation. Mia could hear fragments. "Matched description, acting suspicious," and it made her stomach turn. She wanted to scream that it wasn't true, but fear kept her quiet. The second officer, a woman with a calm demeanor, turned to Mia. "What's your name?" she asked softly, her tone a stark contrast to the first officer's aggression. Mia hesitated, then answered quietly, explaining again that she was just walking home. The female officer glanced at the crowd, then back at Mia. Her brow furrowed, as if something didn't add up. Then, a man pushed through the crowd, waving his phone. "I just checked my security camera footage," he shouted. "The person you're looking for doesn't even look like her." All eyes turned toward the officers, the moment brimming with tension as everyone waited for their next move. The officer holding Mia stiffened at the man's words. "Stay back," he barked, but the man didn't move, holding his phone higher. "You're making a mistake," the man said firmly. The female officer took a step closer to him, asking calmly, "Can I see the footage?" He nodded and handed her the phone, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. As she watched, the crowd pressed in slightly, murmuring in anticipation. Mia's heart raced, her eyes darting between the officer and the phone. The footage clearly showed someone else, an older teen with a completely different build and hairstyle, running from the scene of the theft. It was undeniable evidence, yet the first officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as if trying to find a way to justify his actions. But before anyone could react further, a woman from the crowd shouted, "Wait a minute. I recognize that guy in the video." She pointed toward the far corner of the street, where a figure was trying to blend into the background, his hoodie pulled low. Everyone turned, including the officers, as the real suspect began to walk quickly, then break into a run. The female officer immediately sprang into action, radialing for assistance while the first officer froze, his grip on Mia loosening. The focus shifted, but Mia's ordeal wasn't over yet. The crowd wasn't letting the first officer off the hook that easily. Voices rose in frustration and anger, demanding accountability for his behavior. All eyes were on him, and the question lingered. Would he admit his mistake or continue to deflect? The crowd watched as the real suspect bolted down the street, with the female officer and her partner in hot pursuit. Meanwhile, Mia stood frozen, the weight of the ordeal still heavy on her shoulders. The first officer, now visibly flustered, released her arm and muttered, "You're free to go." But the crowd wasn't having it. "You owe her an apology," someone yelled, and others quickly joined in. The officer's face turned red, and for a moment, it looked like he might walk away without saying anything. Then, under the pressure of the growing unrest, he turned to Mia. "I made a mistake," he said stiffly, the words forced and devoid of sincerity. Before Mia could respond, the female officer returned, out of breath but victorious. "We got him," she announced, holding up the suspect's bag, which contained stolen items. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the officer's next words silenced everyone. "And he confessed something else," she said, looking directly at the first officer. "He admitted he's the one who called in the fake tip, describing Mia to throw us off." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the first officer's face fell. It was now clear that his assumptions and actions had made him a pawn in the real criminal's plan. The irony was almost too much to bear. The female officer turned to Mia. "I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said sincerely. "We'll be filing a full report on this." Though shaken, Mia managed a nod, her voice quiet but steady. "I just want to go home," she said. As the crowd began to disperse, many approached Mia to offer their support. The incident had sparked outrage, but also a sense of solidarity. Justice had been served. The lesson lingered in the air. Assumptions can cause harm, and accountability is key. As Mia walked away from the scene, a mix of relief and exhaustion washed over her. Neighbors who had once been strangers now smiled at her, offering words of comfort. It felt strange, but also reassuring, to see people standing together on her behalf. The female officer assured Mia and her family that the false tip and wrongful detainment would be thoroughly investigated. True to her word, the department later issued an apology, and steps were taken to hold the first officer accountable. While it couldn't erase what had happened, it was a small step toward making things right. For Mia, the experience was eye-opening. It reminded her of the power of speaking up and the importance of staying strong in the face of injustice. Though she hoped never to endure something like that again, she knew one thing for sure: her community's support made all the difference. Justice, though delayed, had prevailed.